Hey, peace, family. Welcome to another episode of We Charge Colonialism Podcast and Book Club. I am Ikemba, head writer and researcher of We Charge Colonialism.
Peace, everyone. This is Frank, host for the Revolutionary Educational Lecture Series.
All right, and we're going to have, Natasha and Tierney will be joining us soon. So, we'll have a full panel and a great discussion this morning. So I want to appreciate everybody who's tuning in right now. And like I always say, like this podcast, share this podcast, get your people on here so they can be a part of this powerful and dynamic discussion as we are here to inform and educate our people. So we charge colonialism, a grassroots think tank. And last week I had seen someone ask the question, what is a grassroots think tank? And so we was kind of middle in our discussion, moved on from our introduction. So I didn't want to circle back to the question, but just to answer that today, we charge colonialism being a grassroots think tank is, organization that relies on the masses, the people, for funding. We organize from a grassroots level, and we take sort of a bottom up approach to the work that we do, and we're not influenced by large corporations that usually sways the powerful think tanks that exist today. So most of these think tanks that have an influence on policy and decisions, political decisions within the United States and other areas that such as Europe and so forth, they have a tremendous influence on policies and the minds and behaviors of the people. So, we take an approach by our influence comes from the people. And I just wanted to put that out there for that question from last week. So, Tim, you want to introduce yourself?
Peace. Sorry. Peace, everyone. This is Tierney. I'm one of the leaders of Blue Church Colonialism.
All right. And Natasha will be joining us. So when one of y'all going over your story, she might need some help getting this. So I'll try to take care of that. But jumping right into things. Also, just some housekeeping. We're going to be transitioning to our previous YouTube channel, We Charge Colonialism. So make sure that you subscribe to that, because on October 1st, we'll be transitioning over there. So we'll no longer be airing from this particular YouTube channel. So get on that right away. There should be a link. Tierney, help me with that. I'll put it in the description next time.
I'll put it in now. Next time you make sure. Cause I probably won't be here next week. So
okay.
Yeah, but I just put it in.
Appreciate you. See, she always got my back. But the link to the book is in the description this week. So I did remember to do that. So we're going to be reading Pan-African history. So Pan-Africanism, a history, the second part of our podcast. So make sure you click on that link so you can be a part of that discussion. So we're going to jump right into our stories. We usually start off with a sort of look at stories around the world as it pertains to African people under the conditions of colonialism, how it's impacting us, and things that we're doing too. It's not always negative. Things that we're doing to build and fight against the institution of colonialism. So just to start off, Tierney, are you ready to start it off?
Well, I actually was gonna not do a story, remember, because
yeah. So Frank, you can set it off, and I'm gonna help Natasha.
Yeah, I can go ahead. So today we are still on Mali. Like I said, we're gonna be on Mali for a very long time. So the Malian authority have come out to accuse France once again, and this time around they have taken France to the United Nations. But we want to see what the United Nations going to do. So this is what the Malian army said in accusation to Mali, to France. So they said, I will just start from here. It says, the letter says there was more than 50 deliberate violation of Malian airspace by foreign aircraft, particularly operated by French forces, and listed several incidents of alleged violation. The government of Mali has several pieces of evidence that these flagrant violation of Malian airspace were used by France to collect intelligences for the benefit of the terrorists, for the benefit of the terrorist group operating in the Shahid, and to drop arm and ammunition to them, to the terrorists. The letter read. So, but in our statement, a response from the French embassy denied the allegation that the Malian army, or authority were saying that if they have several evidence and they found the French army into their airspace, carrying ammunition to the terrorists and bumping it down. Sending it to the terrorists and so forth. So the French embassy denied the allegation. But this is what the Malian authority have said, and they have evidence to prove that the French aircraft were in their airspace and dropping ammunition to the terrorists. But again, the question here is, will the United Nations do anything? As we know who support the United Nations and who behind the United Nations. So the United Nations is an ally to France and the United Kingdom and the United States. So what will the United Nations do in such alleged information against the French army? So this is what's going on right now. But for me, I would say I don't think anything going to come from out of it. But the solution here is, again, we've been saying this over and over. Africa, the solution to it is for all African leaders to come together to find a common understanding and find one united front soldier or army of Africa to fight the African battle.
Hey, appreciate that, Frank, for raising the story. I was looking into it, and it's not surprised that France is sort of like supporting this, quote unquote jihadist group. I don't like these boogeyman names that they be throwing out there to scare folks, terrorist groups, jihadist groups. But I'm not surprised because of how Mali is resisting France colonialism and their presence in Mali. So they're going to do whatever they can, by any means, to undermine what Mali is trying to do. And the people, I think it's important, because the foreign minister came out, just weeks ago. There was a letter, stating the story that you just raised. And I think it's important that African people get behind Mali and support Mali in their transition to be independent of colonial rule, France colonial rule, and to call France out for what it's doing. Like, I think like these type of stories, we look at it as we may look, not us in particular, but the people may look at it like, Mali is just, they just talking, they just chatting, right? That France wouldn't do something like that until a movie come out 10 years later, and, talking about these stories. We see, Europeans have done this before. It's not, that far fetched, but, Tyranny, I know you just came in. I don't know if you heard the story, but Tyranny, if you wanted to add something.
Sure. Well, I think the more interesting thing is that for me, while France has all these allegations against them, and we know that France has to have been violating Mali's airspace, because I don't know if anyone remember, a couple months ago they released these photos and they were saying that this is evidence of a massacre that occurred inside of Mali. And it's like, well, how did you even if that's what it is, like, how would you even be able to get these aerial photos? So we know that they've been violating Mali's airspace. We know that they've still been intervening inside of Mali. Unfortunately, the question is, Mali can't really do anything about it. Like, we can continue writing letters and airing them out, but as a country, you know, what's Mali going to do? Is it going to shoot down a French airplane and then start a whole nother war? And so that's a reminder that inside of this current, you know, global scheme that we're in, that even like the effort to exert sovereignty over one's own nation can fall flat. And that's really what it is. You know, this is something that we've heard continually from the Malian government, that France has been doing things that violates their sovereignty. But unfortunately, as with the United States, as with other NATO allies, we don't have the type of force, the type of power to actually enforce our own sovereignty. And so this is something I think that we have to take as, you know, a cautionary tale, especially those of us who are in other territories that we're trying to see liberated, that until we have a level of power, that these people will still continue to tread on our national borders, still continue to fly wherever they want, and they can do so because unfortunately we don't really have any structure to check them. So that's something I took away from it.
Yeah, indeed. Natasha, welcome. You can introduce yourself. Did you hear the story? Not sure if you caught it.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'm Natasha, and I know I introduced myself the last show that I was on. But I'm new to the platform, and I'm happy to be here. And I didn't get to hear the story, just maybe the end of it. But in terms of just hearing some of the information that, you know, you've just talked about, a little bit of what Frank was saying toward the end, and what Tyranny said, it just reminded me of the chapter that, you know, we're looking at currently in terms of Pan-Africanism and building organizations and having allies and support, whether in the Caribbean, in America, that are able to support Africa and African countries when it comes to being able to have the force and the capacity to defend itself against colonial forces, especially when we're talking about having to defend yourself physically when need be, and the criminalization of Black resistance, of African resistance, no matter where it is. And so we see that like time and time again. So that's my 2 cents into this.
Yeah, Shay. Yeah, I unite, you know, because I mean, if they're doing it in Mali today, they'll do it in Ghana tomorrow, they'll do it in the Central Africa Republic, you know, the next day, Sierra Leone, and so forth. So you know, as a proud, you know, African, understanding that my peoples came through, you know, through the transatlantic, you know, slave trade. You know, I look at myself, I know that there's these different, you know, ethnic groups and so forth, but man, I'm Sierra Leonean, I'm Haitian, Jamaican, like we all African, like, you know, at the end of the day. So, you know, I don't get into those distinctions, but I appreciate our differences in culture, but I understand, like, you know, this is a united struggle and fight to overturn colonialism. And so, you know, just moving to the next story, I'm gonna share my screen. I wanted to cover what was taking place in Alabama, you know, right here in the United Snakes of America. I'm going to share my screen real quick and go through this. Ain't got to spend a lot of time on this story, but all right. Are y'all seeing my screen? And I think it's freezing. Hopefully not. All right. So Alabama City disbands entire police department over racist texts. So just so that you know, that this police department, it's a small town. There was only 3 police officers. So I'll put that out there. But at the same time, when you think of a police department, police station, you know, disbanding, you know, a police station within a community, how many police officers do they have, right? Maybe 20, 30, depending on where you are. But I think this serves as a microcosm of what can happen. You know, they abolished the police department and are bringing in some other, you know, people to take to as intern security or officers for the next year until they replace them. But I say keep them abolished. I'm gonna talk about what we should do. But so in Alabama, City Council voted to disband its police department after police officers sent racist text messages. Vincent Mayor James Latimer said, why it matters. In the latest incident in a reckoning between law enforcement officers and their treatment of Black people, a Mississippi town was sued over alleged pattern of discrimination against Black people. The town former police chief was recorded bragging about having shot and killed 13 people in the line of duty while using the N-word repeatedly. Right? Let that soak in. So details in Alabama, the Vincent City Council voted unanimously to temporarily abolish its police department Thursday night because the town cannot legally fire its officers, Latimer said. Can't legally fire them, so they had to disband it. So these people are still getting paid. That's how I'm interpreting it. The 2 formal complaints and a verbal warning must be given before a city employee, like a police officer, can be terminated. Latimer added that the messages were not the only reason to disband the police department. Flashback, racist text messages from one of the city's 3 police officers were posted online earlier this year, in which the sender made a joke involving slavery and pregnant women. The officers involved were placed on administrative leave, but the city did not have the authority to fire those officers, Latimer said. So what's next? Latimer said that the city plans to contract dedicated police services within the Shelby County Sheriff Office for the next day. All right. So I'm just going to say the answer to it is that we defend and secure our own communities. And I think that what we can do is to prepare for that is organize now. Communities should be organizing, go from block to block. See who's the block captain, who's people who are willing to like step up and begin to, do night watch, day watch, just looking over the community, looking after the community, building relationships with others who agree to do the same thing on their block and so forth, and build an association where we don't need no police officers. There's ways that we can go back to traditions of how did the Africans used to secure their communities, defend their communities without police officers. Like this is a new phenomenon, which is a result of capitalism and so forth. But I'm gonna open it up. I don't want. It's a lot to say on this, but y'all have any thoughts?
No, like I think that the purpose of police isn't public safety. I mean, we have policing in areas really to police us, to make sure, particularly like when it comes to private property. That's the way that I look at the police. Like they want to make sure that we stay inside of our place, make sure that we do not upset the social order. And so really any country that you see a large any white controlled country where you see a dominant like African population, you see these crazy rates of police brutality, whether it's Brazil or South Africa. So I look at the police presence as really the grip of white power over our neighborhoods, over our communities. And the evidence of that, like you said in the story, is that they can't fire these guys. Like if you think about how, like us on the other side of the power of the power struggle. So you have the people who hold the power, then you have these people who are trying to get power, us who are trying to get power, take power. Like I could get fired for so many things, but this cop literally has evidence of saying I killed 13 people and calling them niggers, like. And that won't get him fired. That lets you know where power lies inside of this capitalist system. So we can't be confused about what's backing them up. They're being backed because they're supposed to be there. And even like the idea of, well, we're just going to dismember the police department and bring in people from out of town. Those people are going to have their own issues as far as with African people. A lot of times out of towners are worse whenever they contract with out of towners. Because they'll bring people in from like the outskirts, who maybe never really encountered African people. So like you said, like there's no solution to just saying, we're going to deconstruct the police department. The only real solution would have to be by us. And that is really, finding the means to push these people out of our communities. But I'm not of the opinion that that's going to happen with a intact United States government, you know, with the intact power structure, you know. So there's a lot of work that has to be done on this, and it's not just in Alabama, it's really in the federal government, it's in state governments. And so you know, yeah, that's really my takeaway.
And I agree with Tierney and Brother Kimba in terms of both how we're over policed, especially like when you think of, like, let's say for example, New York City, like Brooklyn, and when you look at where the police are, where the heavy police presence is, if you go to like East New York or you go to Flatbush, you'll just see like police presence 24/7, like cop cars everywhere. But then if you go over to let's say Park Slope, you don't even see any cops over in that area at all. And this is in the same city in Brooklyn. And so, you know, it's clear that we're the ones being, you know, over policed, and the police are there for us, to watch us as a form of surveillance, to make sure that we're not doing anything that, you know, could go against the state. Not necessarily anything when they talk about legality of, you know, what's right and what's wrong, but specifically, you know, doing things that we, you know, that would be building our own communities and creating groups and organizations. So I think that's one thing that we have to realize as a people. And obviously, like, we know that, but I think that the majority of us have known that, you know, to a certain extent. And we know that's why the Black Panther Party came up, because of the heavy surveillance and abuse that was going on in our neighborhoods. And they were working on ways to be able to take control and do these community patrols. And a lot of people don't know that because, you know, they're not really taught it in school and they don't know the history. And so we continue to be in this cycle where the same thing that's happening in New York is happening in Alabama, and police are getting away with it. And so we have to try again. Sorry. My little nephew's in here. But yeah, so I think it's good to see that, okay, they figured out a step to be able to say, this is what we can do for the short term. And like Brother Kimball was saying, we need to be thinking about, okay, how do we replace it? Because people kept saying, oh, abolish the police. But how do you actually do that? And what are you planning to replace it with? What are you doing? Like, how is it organized? We can't just be reactive and say, okay, yeah, this city council, they got, you know, rid of the police for a certain time, but they're going to be the ones who control to say who comes in next. So we have to be proactive in saying, like Brother Kim was saying, okay, what are we going to do? How are we going to police ourselves so that we can already have structures in place, so that when we make a move in whatever cities we decide as a people that we're going to get rid of them, in this type of example that Alabama has presented, but we have something that the people are going to do, not that you get to say we're going to bring in some other group to just continue the same thing.
Can I throw in a quick comment though for whoever, Frank or Kimba? I mean, I think there also has to be a conversation amongst ourselves. Like, I mean, what is our position on calling the police? Because, you know, while we want to organize independently, you know, a lot of times that's just not the case inside of where we are inside of our neighborhoods. And so, you know, what do you say to like get out of that mentality? Because a lot of I mean, there are times where you have to call the police. I mean, so I'm just wondering, like, what y'all have to say about that.
Oh, go ahead, Frank.
Yeah, I mean, like Natasha said, you know, we are the only people in this country that have over police as compared to other community or other race in this country. And at the same time, with the over police in our community, we are the only people that have the most problem with in this country, and that face the most injustices in this country. And like Brandon Kuma said, so what can we do as a people to remedy the situation? Is again to just look at what the other people are doing. If you go into their community, you have to see police, but they are united. They are together. They form their vigilante group. They watch over their community and those things. And I believe strongly if you ask them, they don't want police. But you only see police in one area at a time, maybe just passing through, and, just for patrol. But it's not like you see them in a corner, sitting down watching for somebody to come, to hunt. Unlike the Black community, where you see police on every block hunting the next victim, to take them to the prison system. And before I end, let me just end with this. Whenever a race is targeted for economic purpose, this is what's going to happen. Black people have been targeted in this country since hundreds of years for economic reasons. So we're going to have these things going on just because of that same economic reason, because at the end of the day, the people have to find a way to make money out of Black people. And it is unto us as African people, what can we do to stop these people from making money out of us? So again, we just have to look at what other people are doing in our community, to protect their community, to avoid the over-policing in their community. We have to do the same thing, to come together and avoid the over-policing in our community, because we have come to realize that over-policing is not even helping us, but rather creating more problem for us.
Yeah, and my answer to that question, like I'm all for the abolition of the police, and I agree with what you said, Tierney, in regards to the state itself, America as a state, as a colonial power, needs to be disbanded and dissolved, right? But I think in the community, one of the things that we can do, at least as we transition into this disbandment or the destruction, dismantling of colonial capitalism in America, is like building, again, I raised earlier in regards to going block to block. I think that Chairman Omaya Yeshitela in the Uhuru movement, he talks about building dual and contending power. And we have to be able to, as you said, they're going to call the police, what do we have in place? And I think we have to build that infrastructure. But it takes organization to go into the community, to talk to the people, right? Knock on doors, talk to people, and see who's willing to do what. Because if that's not happening, if it's not being organized on a grassroots level, there's always going to be this dependency. So, being able to build that infrastructure and then getting the word out to the people that, hey, these are some other options for handling, community problems. And there's certain things we're gonna have to get to a level when we're able to handle the gun violence and the drug selling and all of that. But I think there's things that we can do, at least on a small scale, to bring justice within our communities. There's arguments going on between neighbors, some sort of dissension that exists between, people in our communities. But even when you have right where I'm at, there's some groups, young youth that are at odds with each other, and they're fighting against each other. Where are the elders who are able to step in, from each of those communities, step in and say something to the youngsters, the youth from around their neighborhood, to resolve that, bringing those people together? So we just have to build the infrastructure. We can do it, but it's just getting on the ground and knocking on those doors.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot of steps that have to be done, to get to that point. And because there is a reason people do have to call police, and we have a lot to build up to basically supplant those reasons. And so I think that's something for us to keep in mind.
Yeah, indeed. So it's 10:30. Natasha, I know you had a story. It's 10:30. You want to say that story next week? we can transition.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think the story is timely no matter when. So sure, I can say.
All right. Yeah, because it was I was reading it. It is a dope story. We can start off with, I don't even know if you're gonna be here. Look at me. Hey,
I'll be
what y'all think? Should we go into the story?
Let's do it. Why not?
All right, go ahead.
Okay. So the story that I have, it's an article that came out this past Wednesday called for Clean Energy, Financial Growth in Africa. Africa looks to UN. So it's talking about this whole idea that, and I think right now there's been a lot of talk around currently clean energy, environmentalism, global warming. And I think that, you know, as an African people, it's definitely something that we have to make sure that we're paying attention to, and that we're moving toward and at the forefront of for ourselves. Because one, we know that African people are deeply connected to nature, and that it affects us in a particular way. And so this story, some of the key things that I'll point out from it is that when it says like Africa needs longer time frames and more financial resources to move towards clean energy if it still wants to meet its social and economic growth goals. Harsin Nyambe, the director of Sustainable Environment and Blue Economy Division at African Union, told Associated Press. So what I would say about that particular statement is, when this idea of the time frame of where Africa needs to be able to like move toward clean energy, whose time frame is it? One. And then also the article mentions how Africa only emits about like 3% of the actual carbon emissions in the world. We know that the biggest carbon emitters are European countries and China. And so when we think about this whole idea of a time frame for when Africa is supposed to meet its clean energy goals and, you know, its financial goals in terms of development, we know that the whole idea of development came out of colonial nations anyway. And it's looking to the UN to tell it, you know, to give one, the aid that it needs to have this clean energy to grow, but also do it in a way that is sustainable and uses clean energy. But we know that the UN is just basically an organization ran by colonial powers, and really supports colonial powers, because it never decides to hold accountable any colonial nations for any, you know, of the different human rights atrocities that they commit around the world and within their own countries. But they always seem to go after any non-European country that exists, especially when we're thinking about Africa. So I think, you know, one thing that we have to really think about is this idea of what does the future look like for us, and what does it look like when we're talking about this idea of the environment and clean energy, and also this idea that, you know, how Africa is supposed to move toward this idea of growth and development. Because even when we're talking about how Africa is able to develop, and we're talking about you know, carbon emissions, or we're talking about the fact that the climate change, it says Africa is particularly vulnerable to climate change, with little resources to adapt to hotter and drier temperatures in some areas and extreme downpours in others. The Horn and East of Africa are suffering from ongoing devastating drought, which has left populations with little food and water, while southern nations are battered by deadly cyclones with growing frequency. But so in all of these talks, especially when you know, people are talking from the UN about environment, they're never talking about the land and how the dispossession of the land that happened during colonialism has never been settled after Europeans left. A lot of them still own those lands that they took over. Those nomadic tribes that would move depending on the seasons, and their movement with their animals would help with what was going on with being able to sustain the land, grow it, make sure that it doesn't dry out. So all of those ecological necessities have not been restored, and they're talking about, you know, going to the UN to tell them and give them the money they need in order for them to combat some of these things that are happening. But they're not talking about giving back the land. They're not talking about getting off of that land that they've taken, that they still hold in Kenya in the east, that they're talking about Tanzania. You have not given people back their land so that they can farm on it, and so that they're not using land that they're not supposed to, that people are not living in areas that they're not supposed to when they were pushed there during colonialism. So I think we have to really like pay attention to that. And I think like Africa in general, and also Caribbean countries, need to start thinking about, okay, when they're talking about this idea of environmentalism and clean energy and moving and combating climate change, the land is a key part of it, and giving back the land and Europeans getting off of that land is a key part of it that they're not talking about. So that's just like a little bit of,
Yeah, man, yeah, powerful story. I appreciate you bringing that story to this discussion. So many thoughts. One of the things, though, I'm gonna just say, just to keep it brief, is Africans. Or you mentioned the UN, but yeah, like the UN, they support the colonial structure, and Africans, we can't support the colonial structure, this current, international political economy. That's what we're fighting against, and we have to understand that that is the phenomenon. And so, like right now, like just in regards to this story, what Africans are doing is they're looking to imitate Europeans in regards to their economy and so forth. Europeans is transitioning from the old economy into a new sort of economy, right? And Africa is sort of in the predicament that China it was in too, because China was pushing back against this whole fossil fuel, this transition from fossil fuels, because like now they're developing as a result of their investment in fossil fuels and so forth, right? Or this dependency on it. And so the same thing with Africa, right? Now that Europeans transitioning from that, the old economy is going to become obsolete. And this is part of the story they were raising, that like what's going to happen when Africa is sort of like dependent on like the old way of the old, economy, the old political economy. So I'm gonna leave it there. It's just, the one thing like Africans, is important that we get away from. We can get away from the fossil fuels and all of that. We just have to start doing business with and trade with each other, and get rid of this dependency on the whole European colonial structure. So I'll leave it there. There's some other thoughts, but I want to add anything.
Yeah, and maybe we have to extend a little bit the book reading. But yeah, so I think you made a lot of great points, Natasha. And it's funny, I was just watching earlier today the I don't know like how much people have been watching this whole energy crisis in Europe, but literally like European countries who are so afraid of what's going to happen in the winter as far as their energy reserves, because Russia is basically shutting them off of their oil since they sanctioned them. So they're so afraid of their of what's going to happen that now they're doing all these things to save energy. So for example, like they said, I think they said in Germany, like the buildings that they light up, the public buildings that they just light up all the time, they're shut off. I think it was Spain, they're saying no more AC inside of the airports. Like different, like all over Europe, they have all these like, oh, don't have the air at this temperature, don't have it on inside of these types of places, and it's like, all this time y'all been talking about climate change, and we know that the big emitters of carbon are, as was stated, the US, Europe, I think China is up there too. And yet you're talking to Africans about like, oh, this is what you should be doing to switch over. Like you now understand that now that you're in an energy crisis, hey, maybe we should cut back on what we're doing. But you could have been doing this the whole time while you were lecturing the world about clean energy and how we need to, find ways to save, and, lecturing third world or the global south about, we're doing things wrong. And we know that we're the ones that don't emit the most. The other thing though, is that a lot of these energy things are creating new problems, because there was like one story I saw, they said the solar panels create waste. Like basically, like once they go bad, like they don't know what to do with these solar panels. And so, even like the West, when they're laying out like this is what we should be doing, they themselves are basically dumping these things. We know where they like to dump it, like in our country. So like this is the contradictions inside of the European colonialists, their righteousness, and on the best day when they're supposedly trying to do best for the world, they're really trying to do best for themselves and really cause more damage to the environment. And so this is why we have to, I think, like shut them off as far as like telling us what to do, kind of like turn it off in our heads. I know it's difficult because, you know, you're surrounded by their propaganda everywhere, whether you're in university, whether you watch the news, whatever. But we have to keep in mind, Africans had an indigenous way of living prior to ever encountering the colonial system that we can draw from, that doesn't include their quote unquote solutions, that is more African centered. And we didn't have these problems until the Europeans basically took over and started impressing on us their way of life. So I agree, Kimba, like the big problem is, you know, we need to stop trying to be like them. But that's a whole that's a whole conundrum that we talk about all the time in this program. But yeah, I appreciate the story.
Hey, did you want to add anything, Frank?
No, man, everything has been said, so we can just go to, I mean, it has been said, yeah.
All right, appreciate it. And thanks everyone for tuning in. Everybody that continues to tune in and participate, you know, stay engaged in the chat. I appreciate you all. Continue to like and share the podcast. And again, make sure you subscribe to We Charge Colonialism, our previous channel, because we'll be making a transition come October 1st. Also, another way to support us too is become a Patreon member. You can do that today. So visit Patreon, We Charge Colonialism, and become a member to support our organization as we continue to do research and put out information to be a part of the decolonization process, decolonizing the minds and bodies of African people. So with that being said, we're going to make the transition, and we're starting in the book. The link is in the description. We're reading Pan-Africanism, a History by Hakeem Adi, and we're on page 25. Yeah, we're on page 25, chapter 2, Pan-Africanism and Garveyism. And I'm really looking forward to getting to this. So page 25, the Pan-African Network. And it's interesting. We kind of jumped here. We was talking about the first Pan-African conference that wasn't actually called the Pan-African Conference, but it was a conference that took place in Chicago in 1890, I want to say 3. And then there was another conference in 1895, and then you would have what was termed the first Pan-African Conference in 1900, which was organized by Sylvester Williams. And what's interesting, I hope you guys are reading, just, you know, for people that's viewing, because they talk about, Haiti's involvement in actually like the building of the first Pan-African Conference, because, you know, even before I got into this book, there's always talk about Sylvester Williams from Trinidad and Trinidad's influence on Pan-Africanism. But it's interesting to reading this history and seeing like the people who were coming out of Haiti and actually like met with Sylvester Williams and sort of influenced him to, you know, build this conference. So I think that was some important history. But we can go into this chapter, the Pan-African Network. So following the London Conference, several years passed before such a major event was again organized. Nevertheless, several of the key figures remained active and further developed various aspects of Pan-Africanism. In a series of lectures and articles, Edward Blyden elaborated his notion of the uniqueness of the African personality, as well as his defense of African traditions and political and economic institutions, most notably in African life and customs. Amongst other things, Blyden claimed that traditional African institutions were not unlike the socialism desired by so many in Europe. Mojola Agbebi likewise continued to oppose Eurocentrism and to defend African forms of Christianity, championing the inclusion and promotion of African music, culture, and languages. Blyden's and Agbebi's writings were followed avidly not only by those with a Western education in Africa, but also by Africans in the diaspora in Europe and the United States. Pan-Africanist ideas were central to J.E. Casely Hafer's novel, Ethiopia Unbound, Studies in Race Emancipation, 1911, which he dedicated to the sons of Ethiopia the world over. Joseph Ephraim Casely Hayford was a lawyer, journalist, writer, and politician born into a prosperous elite family in the British colony of the Gold Coast. His reputation was made first as an anti-colonial journalist, then as a lawyer defending indigenous land rights. He worked with the Aborigines Rights Protection Society and was later a founding member of the National Congress of British West Africa and a major sponsor of the British-based Pan-Africanist Duse Muhammad Ali's African Times and Orient Review. Ethiopia Unbound can be seen as another example of the Ethiopianism that influenced Marcus Garvey. Considered by some to be the first Pan-African novel, it was also partly autobiographical. Its literal form was simply a means to allow a discussion of many of the main political concerns of the Pan-Africanists of the day. Through Kwamakra, the novel's main character, Casey Hayford praises the works of Horton and especially Blyden as designed to reveal elsewhere the African unto himself, to lead him back into self-respect and to restore his true place in creation on natural and national lines. The novel is concerned with developing the African nationality, encouraging race emancipation, and proudly claims that Africa was the cradle of civilization. It looks forward to the prospect of those of African descent around the world modernizing African society, whilst retaining its best African features in the manner of Japanese modernization. Casely Hayford therefore also advocated the creation of a university in West Africa that might combat the Eurocentrism that accompanied colonial rule. I could, just stop there for a second and reflect. One of the things I appreciate is how you have sort of like these leaders in this, quote unquote, like Pan-Africanism is like really developing as a concept at this time, like with the term Pan-Africanism. And but they had given us some context of how Pan-Africanism is developing. As you can see, Edward Blyden talking about the African identity, right? And just making the distinction. I think all of this too is a response to Eurocentrism, which is being talked about right here. They're talking about developing universities in West Africa, like, so they're creating a Pan-African institution in the sense where, this institution isn't for any particular ethnic group. It's a university to educate Africans and to combat Eurocentrism and colonialism. So I'm just appreciating sort of like we're kind of like seeing the development of what we see today in regards to Pan-Africanism and the sort of like the African thought, the African identity right here. And I know they kind of, before this chapter, they go back even further, but I'm seeing it like crystallizing in this history right here. But wondering if y'all had any thoughts.
For me, one of the key things I thought about, Ryan, in this specific section of this chapter was this creating of the Western, the university in West Africa in order to combat the Eurocentrism. And it just makes me think of the ways in which which was talked about before. One, Black people deciding that, they would want to go back to Africa on their own. But also during these times, how, we had all these Black institutions where Black people were literally funding their own schools to be able to teach, Black children, and how we've continued on, even when we talk about the, African centered education movement that happened in the 1970s and forward. And so the importance of having institutions to combat this colonial mentality that we've been given, and recognizing that literally Europe, wherever they've gone, one of their purposes was to go ahead and make sure they get you out of your African mind and into a Eurocentric mind, and the importance of having institutions that are directly combating that assault on our mental.
Yeah, I also like the intentionality, because we saw before with early, Africa movements that it was more like, we're going to civilize you in the European way of lifestyle, even coming from Africans in the US and in the West, thinking that the European lifestyle was superior. And in this context, we're starting to see like a real appreciation of our own culture, our own way of doing things and saying that, no, we come from a culture that is superior, honestly, particularly when you think about the treatment of our own people. I mean, I think there can be no argument that when you look at how people are being treated today inside of the so-called advanced societies and compared to how we treated our own people historically and showed Ubuntu and things like that, like it's in my opinion superior. And so having that intentionality behind this wave of Pan-Africanism, I think, is very important, and not just saying we're going to connect with Africa just to spread Western ideals.
Did you want to add anything, Frank?
I mean, just to add, I'm just glad and seeing the work of Pan-Africanism, into our generation, because realistically, that's the fear of the worst. For African in the diaspora to feel that they are not part of the system, but rather they are African within the system, and they sympathize as African, and they see themselves as African, and they see the African continent as their home, as their place, as their continent, right? And I'm very glad that in this time of our identity, that African all around the world are beginning to realize that, hell no, I am not part of this system that have been holding me down for decades of years, for years, and that have not even recognized me, despite my struggle for the system, despite I'm dying for the system, despite I'm trying to believe in the system, but the system does not believe in me and does not protect me. So I'm glad to see in this generation how we are heavily involved into the African identity. And that is not to say I'm taking credit away from those area African that fought to identify themselves, to identify their culture, because these are people that their culture were taken away from them. They put them in different groups, and that they shouldn't speak the same language. So people that spoke the same language, they took them and put them with another people that spoke different language, and that alone made them to lose their culture. But I'm glad that in the 1800s, they saw it necessary that they were not part of this system, and they will now be part of this system, and they tried to identify their culture, their heritage, and their continent. And this generation, we are doing the same thing, which is the fear of the enemy.
Yeah, appreciate that. For those who's just joining, we're on page 26 at the top, the first paragraph on page 26. So I'll continue on. Both Casely Hayford and Blyden sent messages of greetings to Booker T. Washington's International Conference on the Negro held at Tuskegee in 1912. It is possible that both Washington and Thomas T. Fortune had planned to hold such a gathering even earlier, but it was not designed to develop the overtly political concerns established by the Pan-African Conference held in London in 1900. It is not to be considered a Pan-African gathering, despite the later view of Du Bois that it constituted one. Indeed, it was mainly directed at missionaries, including those of the AUME and the AUMEZ churches, as well as colonial governments, with the aim of discussing to what extent the vocational education methods developed at Tuskegee Institute might be employed in the African and Caribbean colonies. Both Bishop Walters and Turner attended, and Casey Hayford's message did strike a Pan-African chord, as he called for unity between those in West Africa and the United States and the development of an African nationality. A more representative event was the founding of the Negro Society for Historical Research, launched in 1912 in the United States by John E. Bruce and the bibliophile of Puerto Rican origin, Arthur Schomburg. Both were associated with the American Negro Academy, founded by Alexander Cromwell in 1897. The new society aimed to study Negro history, but also to collect rare books, documents, and photos relating to the subject. Amongst his honorary and corresponding members were several African rulers, as well as Du Bois, Blyden, Casely Hayford, Agbebi, and Allen Locke. 1885 to 1954. Later, a prominent figure of the Harlem Renaissance. Members in Britain included the Jamaican Pan-Africanist writer T.E.S. Scholes, Duse Muhammad Ali, and the Nigerian Moses, the Racha. Both the Rocha and another member, F.Z.S. Peregrino, a Gold Coaster active in South African politics, sometimes as a government informer, had attended the 1900 Pan-African Conference. There were several representatives from the British West Indies, as well as from Panama, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Costa Rica, and Brazil. The member from Panama was Marie du Chatelier, later an organizer with Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. Let's see. Let me stop there. There's a lot, because in each of these paragraphs, I mean, they really.
Yeah, I was gonna say, because like I think everyone's excited to talk about Garvey. Maybe like you could continue from here next time, because.
Okay.
Yeah, like we need to give Marcus Garvey more time.
All right. So we start from right here. Next time, I think in here it raising there's a lot of names being put out there, which had me excited. Just like, first of all, like being familiar with a lot of these names here, makes me just like really want to get even into the history of these individuals and what they were bringing to Pan-Africanism, right? Duse Muhammad Ali in particular, like he is someone who had a lot of influence on Pan-Africanism and Marcus Garvey. When Marcus Garvey went to London, he was a writer, editor for Duse Muhammad's Oriental African Times and Oriental Review. And then Duse Muhammad will come to the United States and be an editor for Marcus Garvey's newspaper, the Negro World. So there's, that connection. But, many of these people, Schomburg, but just the places that they're from, they're talking about people from occupied Zambia, people from Costa Rica, Puerto Rico, that's Pan-Africanism. These people coming together and like, how are we going to deal with colonialism? How are we going to organized for African power? So I was just appreciating that. And last point, they brought up Costa Rica, and it just made me think of like now I was just speaking to someone in Costa Rica, and they're having their is it Dia del Negro? I hope I'm saying that right. Dia de Negro, I guess the Day of the Negro, going on in Costa Rica right now. And but that just speaks to the African presence right there in Costa Rica. And Marcus Garvey went to Costa Rica. And part of his influence of creating the Garvey movement is what he's seen in places like Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Jamaica, London, and the United States. So, yeah, if y'all had any thoughts, it's a lot.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I said like we have to we need another show devoted to this, because it's important to understand what created Marcus Garvey, like what influences. I mean, most people know Booker T. Washington, but we don't know like the host of other organizers, other people who were also out there proclaiming, Africa for Africans, or maybe not in those exact words, but proclaiming things of that nature before he got on the scene. And if we go by like the textbooks, our oppressors, writings, we'll think that Garvey just came and went. And so obviously we know his presence, he inspired so many after, but knowing the backstory of who actually inspired him, that's very important too. I, love that we're at a time in history where, I think for a while, like a lot of people didn't want to, they counted Booker T. Washington as being like just some like, Uncle Tom or something like that. And I love that we're at a time in history where people are actually going back to reevaluate, what he was calling for. Because I even remember as a kid, like the way that history was taught, by a white curriculum, was that, W.E.B. Du Bois, who has respect also, obviously, but, he wanted to fight the racism, and Booker T. Washington just wanted to basically say, white people, you can be racist, and, we'll deal with ourselves. And I'm like, well, that's crazy with the way that they framed it. But when you actually look at what he was saying that this white system, it's going to have to be dealt with, but we're not in a condition as a people to deal with it. And if you think about how we are right now today, we're not in a condition to deal without the system. We have to build up power. We have to build up institutions, places of knowledge. We have to build up independent institutions that are not going to be funded by George Soros or Bill Gates. Like, we have to build up that type of power before you can even talk about dismembering white supremacy. And so we have a lot of people, I think, now who realize, like, we have to go back to what he was talking about, because it makes no sense when, you know, you even look at the gains that someone like Booker T. Washington had back then, and you compare our people now to what they were back then, and it's like, wow, we really went backwards. Clearly we're missing something. Clearly he was advocating something, and we've erased it from our ideas of liberation, and now we're suffering because of it. And so I like that we can have appreciation for him now, not just his influence on Garvey, but what he was calling for African people to do. So I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah. And I just wanted to add, in terms of, like, you both were saying, the people who we don't learn about, like all of these people from around the world. And I think a lot of the times today, people like to think about the divisions between Caribbeans and, you know, Africans here in America, Africans born on the continent, because they don't really know the way in which we really work together when we think about Pan-Africanism, and how really it was a cross-continental movement and partnership that is not highlighted when you learn about, you know, well, one, you really don't learn about Marcus Garvey in schools, but if you do, you don't get that whole background. And I actually recently, this past summer, found out about Thomas T. Fortune and all of the things that he was doing, and how, you know, he had written a book and owned newspapers, and there was like this whole picture of him and Marcus Garvey and all of these other people around that same time meeting and working together. And that he was, even when Ida B. Wells was being, you know, they were coming after her, and, you know, they had burned, I think it was her newspaper or something, that he paid for her to come up to New York to live. And that, you know, she lived in downtown Brooklyn. And that was, you know, so all of these things that we don't know, and the way that we supported each other and funded our own things when we're talking about building institutions, so that if we are doing things, and we don't have to be scared of, you know, oh, if I do this or if I do that, then there's nothing left for me because there are no Black institutions to support you. But when you build those institutions, you can really support and be able to, like, move in the way that you want to, so that you can help support those who are doing the work, and are really, you know, making the changes that need to be made, and don't have to worry about not having anybody to support them, and not having the capacity to do the work because you can't support yourself in that kind of way. So I think it's really important to know about these people and know the things that they've done, and how they were all a part of building what we know is Pan-Africanism.
Oh, go ahead, Frank. You wanted to add something?
Yeah, let me just add a quick to, you know, what other of you guys said. And I mean, Tiana, you said it right about Booker T. Washington, you know, in his analysis, in his approach. You see, and like you said, you know, having a notion of Booker T. Washington based on what the American curriculum gave to us, you know, it's not going to be in our interest, and it's not going to make our team, you know, productively towards, you know, Black people. So just from that analysis that you have given about Booker T. Washington, and then you look at the philosopher of Garvey, you can see that they were kind of, you know, they kind of relate, especially in the sense that this was a man, and I believe one of the reasons why his movement was so vast, you know, to the extent it was because he has his own, you know, publisher as well. So that's one of the things. So it's like the story he put out there, and, you know, and his follower read it, and they believe it, and they love it, and they trusted it. So, and that's one thing I believe that also made his movement at that time period. Imagine no internet, no radio station, like, you know, to just send out information. But being a man like that at that time, you know, and to have that kind of a large movement, it wasn't something easy to just do. Sometimes I wonder, how did he do it? Because here we are in this time period, we have these technologies that we can use and stuff to really get that mass, you know, participation of African people. It's not easy. that you really have to talk, and talk. But here is the time where he never had that information or that system or that opportunity, but was able to put people together. I think that was based on his newspaper that he was publishing and putting out African information in there and getting it out there. And I believe that's the same thing, we as WCC, we are doing, where we have our own publisher, publish our article, our news report and put them out there and make, our follower or our people to go and read it, which is very important. And I just want to say, David did well at that time, looking at that time.
And maybe the internet, well, I've been saying this, but it's more of a handicap than an asset, because many of the people who we love, they didn't have it. So it's going to throw that out there.
That's interesting. Yeah. I want to have a discussion on that. But we've run out of time, man. I want to appreciate everybody for joining us. But hey, really quick though, make sure that you check out yesterday's podcast or yesterday's discussion. Frank was going in. It's Sierra Leone and Liberia on the path to socialism. The plot with exclamation points. So he did that yesterday. I still don't know how you be doing 2 hours and counting, man. But check that out. He goes into socialism and Julius Nyerere, Ujamaa and so forth. So powerful podcast. I mean, powerful discussion that was had. So you can check that out. Also, our latest article put out by Jamal Brewer. Just as Frank said, we publish our own articles. Go to wechargecolonialism.org. Our main focus, Africa First. And he goes in and talking about repatriation, what intentions you have when going to Africa, and Pan-Africanism, the importance of Pan-Africanism. So it's a short read. Check that out. And all of the other articles that have been published on our website, we put out some really good information. Also, there's a link. Make sure that you subscribe to We Charge Colonialism. We're moving over October 1st. So make sure you do that. Also, we just had our Pan-African conference, and those videos are available. Are they available on this channel? Or?
No, African Unity Movement for Decolonization. If you look that up on YouTube, they have many of the videos that we that were put out from the convention. So yeah. So if you missed that, you definitely want to check that out. So again, appreciate everybody for joining this discussion. We will be back next Saturday, same time, same place. All right. Let me get myself together. Got to get used to this right here. And I'm supposed to end the broadcast.